This is session number 2, but the class notes are in the shared file folder, electronic version, as well as each of these PowerPoints and additional files that I'll share throughout the course. Our mode of procedure or mode of operation is we're following the content of my book that's scheduled to be released in May of 2026, May 27th. It's available already on Amazon for pre-order, but we're looking at the 50 archaeological discoveries that affirm, I think, the 50 most important archaeological discoveries. Had to narrow it down because there's many wonderful discoveries to talk about, but we're working through sequentially in the order in which they appear in the book, but also in the Bible, right? So we're going to start with the early pre-kingdom era. And so how did I choose these 50 discoveries? Well, my criteria, the first criteria was that the archaeological artifact or site had to corroborate, validate some person, place, thing, or event recorded in Scripture. So there's lots of archaeological discoveries, thousands and thousands, that are helpful and valuable and maybe give us a better understanding of the cultural milieu in which the books of the Bible were written, and the culture of the people and the places. But I'm highlighting and emphasizing those that corroborate or validate or affirm. I like the word affirm because we know the Bible's all inspired and inerrant. It's not proving it, it's affirming what we already know to be true. And so we're looking at 50 discoveries that affirm the historicity and reliability of Scripture by mentioning people, places, events. Times they'll mention and affirm 8, 9 different things, and we'll list those each session together. The second criteria is that the artifact or site had to have a strong consensus among conservative biblical archaeologists as being genuine. So we, the majority that are joining us virtually and watching this later, and those who are present here, we believe the Bible is inspired and inerrant. And so our inclination is to embrace things maybe too quickly. And so we do want to be discerning and not, there are things that have been faked, things that have caught Christians off guard. And so our natural inclination is to believe something or want to, right? If it has the name Abraham on it, we want to say, hey, look here. But sometimes there's some items that are still being discussed and debated, and so it's not a consensus. Most interesting one right now is the Shroud of Turin, right? Or Turin. Well, I wouldn't say there's a consensus among scholars. There's definitely not a consensus. There's more and more that are believing it. I'm still skeptical myself, but I want to include only those that are a strong preponderance of evidence that we can say, yes, indeed, this is Caiaphas's ossuary, or this is indeed a first-century crucified victim's bone, or this indeed refers to Israel in the land, as we'll look at the Merneptah Stele today. So that's my second criteria. Then the third are discoveries that needed to be particularly relevant to preachers, teachers, Bible study leaders. So I hope that this family of resources, this course that we're teaching now, the 51 videos that come with this course and with the book, and then the book, the covers 51, and then the QR codes that goes to those videos, and then the PowerPoints that are being given for free to go with all this, that pastors and teachers, Bible study leaders can incorporate these discoveries into their preaching and teaching to help affirm to their people, right? Because the Bible is continually under attack. And even young people need to know what they have in their hands when they go off to university. It's going to be under attack by their PhD professors. And so I hope that these discoveries, I even thinking about working on a homeschool type simplified version of this that could be available for young people to have a greater confidence. And they're told the Bible is inspired and inerrant, but but Mormons are told the same, right, with their book. So the difference is ours rests on history and archaeology, and the archaeological record affirm it. And so I did pull maybe 20 different Bible scholars and Bible professors and archaeologists as I was writing this book. Give me your top 50, right? So I had an intern, you might remember Sam Allen, he was my intern here. He helped to collect that information from different scholars around the United States and a few in Europe, and then say, okay, the top, I'd say 30 were almost all the same. Almost everybody agreed on the top 30. Of course, people's interests led to, if someone's especially into manuscripts, they were going to have a lot more manuscripts on their list, or New Testament scholars are going to be referencing New Testament discoveries, Old Testament scholars, Old Testament discoveries, people especially interested in teaching on the life of Christ, things that relate to Jesus himself. So I collected different listings from different professors and scholars, and of course, I made the final decision. So that's how I chose the topics that we're discussing in this course, as well as in my book. And our plan and procedure, we mentioned this last week, we're going to begin and we're going to follow the different eras of time, and that's how I've got them organized. And we're going to be looking first at the pre-kingdom era. By pre-kingdom era, I mean before the United Kingdom, and I'm not talking about Britain, Great Britain. We're talking about the United Kingdom and Israel, when it's David, Solomon, and before that, Saul. Separation into two kingdoms, right? So that's the pre-kingdom era. That would be everything leading up to the kingdom being established and Saul being king. So that's what we'll be looking at this week. Then we'll look at some discoveries from the kingdom era during the time of David and Solomon especially. And then also after the division into the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, we'll look at some discoveries relating to some of those kings as well. Then we'll look at the exilic period. Remember, the 10 northern tribes are taken into exile by the Assyrians. The 2 southern tribes are taken into captivity by the Babylonians. So that would be the exilic period. And then the post-exilic period, when they return after captivity, following Haggai and Zechariah the prophets and Zerubbabel and Nehemiah back to the land of Israel to rebuild the temple and the walls and reoccupy or live back in the land again. Then we'll also look at the New Testament era as it relates to Jesus and his life and ministry. Then finally, we'll look at the New Testament era and the apostles, discoveries related to the Apostle Paul and John and others. So that's where we're heading in this course. And today we're looking at some pre-kingdom era discoveries. And the first discovery I want to talk about is the Sumerian King List. Sumerian King List. Now, we talked about how the further back in time you go, the less and less archaeological remains you'll find, because that's just the nature of time and the nature of things that deteriorate. When you're talking about 3,000, 4,000 years ago, not much survives unless it's like this. It's etched into clay and hardened in an oven, or into a stone tablet or stone monument. And of course, as we look at these discoveries, most of them are going to be by pharaohs and foreign kings, like Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus and Merneptah and Shishak down in Pharaoh, and a pharaoh down in Egypt. Why? Because they wanted to make a name for themselves. So they etched things into stone and they wrote them into clay tablets or clay cylinders. Well, that's not what God called Abraham and his descendants to do, right? They weren't to worship and magnify and memorialize people. They were to worship Yahweh. And so we don't have a lot from the hands of the Hebrew people for that reason. So the Sumerian King List is interesting, and it relates to very early on to before the flood. So we will be referring to the scriptures here. Scriptures want to turn in your paper or your pixels to Genesis chapter 5. Here we have a list of different people from Adam, the genealogy from Adam to Noah. And they're listed here in Genesis chapter 5. We have the mention of Adam. He lived, in verse 5, he lived 930 years. Then verse 6 mentions Seth, and then verse 8 mentions he lived 912 years. Then Enosh, who lived 905 years. Then Kenan, who lived 910 years, verse 14. And then Enoch, verse 18. And then verse 20, who lived 365 years. That's skipping down to verse 23. He lived much shorter. Why is that? He was taken up, right? He was taken to be with God. Verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not. Took him. Then we have a reference in verse 27 to Methuselah, who lived 969 years, right? The oldest person in the Bible, right? Lived the longest, Methuselah. Lamech, chapter 5, verse 28 is mentioned. In verse 31, he lived 777 years. And then Noah. Then we have the account of Noah and the flood. And then at the end, after the flood, and after a period of time, chapter 9, verse 29, we get the age of Noah when he died. Verse 29, we read, so all the days of Noah were 950 years. So very long lifespans. That's the pre-flood, and that's before the flood. And so we have 10 generations mentioned, so that's important. Remember, 10 generations before the flood. Adam lived 930 years. We looked at that. Methuselah lived the longest lifespan, was 969 years. That's a long period of time to live. That's well over 9 times any of us will live, probably. Noah lived 950 years, and then Noah, of course, in the Genesis account, is the one who survived the great flood. He lived beyond the flood. All of that's important when we get to the Sumerian King List. So I'm giving you the biblical details, and then we'll look at the Sumerian King List, the artifact, and then we'll discuss what's significant about it relating to this biblical account. So then you have after the flood. We won't go over all of the different individuals here, but Shem is 600 years, lives all the way down to Jacob, 147 years. And that's all recorded in the biblical account. And a straightforward reading of Genesis tells us there's a long lives prior to the flood, life, the length of life diminished drastically. Right? So post-flood, Shem lives 600 years. Peleg lives 239 years, just highlighting a few. And then Abraham lived only 175 years. I say only, but that's not much compared to the pre-flood descendants. Jacob lived 147 years. So we have a pre-flood situation, a post-flood situation, drastic change in lifespans. This is, I'll quote myself here. It's reasonable to surmise that the impacts of a global flood upon the environment, along with continued genetic mutations from one family, right? Now you just have one family in Noah and his descendants, would result in drastically reduced lifespans, just as the Bible indicates. Right? This is the conservative perspective on the Bible, that what we read in Genesis reflects reality, that the natural reading, what Moses was communicating to us, right? Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, that there were long lifespans, the flood occurred and the lifespans reduced drastically.
I thought it meant that Jesus said, for the sake of my people, the days will be shortened. That's what I thought it meant. Thought what you meant when you said we have shorter lifespans. Is that what Jesus said? No.
You think in Matthew 24 when...
for the sake of us people, the days will be short.
Well, that's actually referring to the tribulation period.
Oh, okay.
Where it says that if it weren't for the sake of this shortening that time, that not even the elect would survive, right? And so limiting the tribulation period to short to 7 years. Right? Now that opens up a lot of other conversations. You have to refer to my class that you were part of on the life of Christ on Matthew 24. We have a video on that. You can take a look at that, Matthew 24 and 25. Yeah, I think the genetic mutation certainly effects upon the world through the flood, I think probably had some effects as well. This isn't my area of expertise, but certainly the impact of the sun upon us, I think that probably changed as well. So there's significant changes to the environment in which we live. And then also the genetic mutations, I think, would result in shortened lifespans. So the Sumerian King List causes us first to ask and answer the question, who are the Sumerians, right? Who are the Sumerians? Before we get to the Sumerian King List, I think it's helpful, a little bit information here. Well, the Sumerians were a people group who established one of the earliest identified civilizations of Mesopotamia. So the Sumerians were an early people group living in Mesopotamia, which is where Abraham's from originally, right? That's where he left to come to the promised land. And so one of the earliest civilizations that we know of. Right? And so here is Mesopotamia. Now, of course, you see on the left here, we see Israel over here, right? Here's Jordan over here, Iraq, Iran. So Mesopotamia is this area, this green area, going down to the Persian Gulf. This is where where the Ninevites were up here, and Abraham is from Ur down here. So this is Mesopotamia. It's between the Euphrates River on the left there and the Tigris River. So it goes up this direction, right? This is what we refer to as Mesopotamia. So the Sumerians, again, an early civilization. So they had a language that they created known as Sumerian. Now the Sumerian King List is actually, there are at least 15 Sumerian King Lists that have been discovered in various locations of the ancient world. So this is just one of them. This is the most well-known one, the most complete one, which is known as the Weld-Blundell Prism. And so the Sumerian King List was discovered in this particular one, the Weld-Blundell Prism, was discovered in the ancient city of Larsa in modern-day southeastern Iraq. And this, again, would be in ancient Mesopotamia. So to give you an idea where Larsa is, I'll zoom in on this thanks to Google Earth. So again, this is Mesopotamia. This would be where the Sumerian ancient civilization, along with near Ur, where Abraham would have been from as well. So the Sumerian King List was named after Herbert Weld-Blundell, this particular one, the Weld-Blundell Prism, who donated the prism to the Ashmolean Museum in the University of Oxford. So that's why the name is kind of odd. It's named after a person. So it was in a person's own collection, but then was donated to the University of Oxford. It's dated to the 18th century BC. Think about that. 18th century BC. That's old. It's in the cuneiform script. A cuneiform is an ancient wedge-shaped writing system, symbols with wedges. But this particular prism is actually in an ancient Babylonian language. And it is inscribed on 4 different sides. You see there's 4 sides to this prism. And this gives you a picture of all 4 of those sides. You can see the portions that didn't survive, but still a great deal of it was kept intact. Then the white and black below it is, of course, the writing out of that to make it more legible, visible to our unaided eye. So it's approximately 8 inches tall and 3.5 inches wide. Not huge. Scholars believe all copies go back to one original source. So the 15 discoveries so far of the Sumerian King List, because it lists kings of Sumeria, supposedly of Sumeria. So they believe it all goes back to one original, and that one original is commissioned by the king of Uruk. And where's the king of Uruk? Also in ancient Mesopotamia, down here, near where it was discovered, actually, Larsa. A well-known scholar by the name of Pritchard says it this way: the king of Uruk's purpose was to argue that his country had always been united under one king, though these kings were ruling successively in different capitals. So now he's writing well past the flood event, but he's trying to connect his rulership all the way back to the first king that existed. This appears to be early propaganda, right? The king of Uruk, he's showing the legitimacy of his rulership and his kingdom by following the line all the way back to when, and as it's quoted on the Weld-Blundell prism, it begins with, after kingship came down from heaven, right? So he's trying to tie his kingdom and his rulership all the way back to when the gods provided kingship, provided this opportunity to have a king over different peoples. And so the Sumerian King List, this one, the Wendell version, has 10 kings listed. Some kings are said to have reigned, and they're different units of time. We don't know exactly what the units of time represent, but different units of time, not in years, but units of time, 18,000 units of time. Whereas other kings lived up to 36,000 units of time. And this is before a great flood. And it records a great flood account. So we see some similarities already, don't we? 10 kings, a great flood, large lifespans. The length of reigns shrink after the great flood. Instead of thousands of units, post-flood kings reigned for just hundreds, and sometimes dozens. So some of the fascinating parallels, again, long lifespans before a great flood account, great flood event. The great flood marks a global reset after the population is wiped out, a significant decline in lifespans after the great flood. And the 10th king, Noah, would be the 10th of the genealogy in Genesis. The 10th king survived the flood. So these are some very interesting parallels, and I would suggest they're not by chance. They're not random. So agreement. Humanity once lived much longer. The Great Flood happened. Lifespans fell drastically after the Great Flood. And the 10th individual survived the Great Flood. So when we think of legend and history, trying to distinguish between legend and history, whether or not the kings on the Sumerian King List were actual historical figures ruling in actual historical cities, as some think, I highly doubt, the list probably reflects, as some scholars say, a memory of earlier longevity passed down from Noah's descendants, who would have been the fathers of all nations, including the Sumerians. So everyone's wiped out, except for Noah and his family. And I'm sure pretty soon after, there were descendants that did not follow after Yahweh. Over time, you lose the truth, and you add legend and fabricate things, right? I think this is the case also with what we call animism, or tribal religions, or indigenous people groups is often the term used in distant locations. It's interesting that in the jungles of South America and all the way over to Indonesia, there are commonalities between different people groups that are completely isolated from one another. Well, what is the commonality? Well, most of them believe in some sort of supreme being. And then they believe that they offended that supreme being in some way, and that now they no longer worship that supreme being, but smaller gods. Well, where did they get this idea of a supreme being that they offended? Well, that may go back to the Table of Nations, Tower of Babel, and the scattering of the people groups all over the world. Well, the further and further away from, once they're scattered, they had a semblance of truth that gets perverted and changed and adapted, but they do believe in a supreme being, and they believe in that they angered that supreme being, which resulted in some sort of distancing from them. Well, I don't know that there's any other. How could such distant people groups have the same concepts? I think same thing here, right, with the Sumerian King List. That what was passed down from Noah, this idea of their ancestors lived longer lifespans, and there was a great flood event. So this is a king of Uruk who's trying to add some myth and legend to elevate his status as a king who goes back all the way back to when the kingship came down from heaven, as the Weld Blundell prism states. You can see the Weld Blundell prism today in the Ashmolean Museum. So the further back we go, we have less remains. Some of the discoveries we'll talk about more have much more significant implications. This one, there's some correlations here that I think are worthwhile to point out. The next discovery we want to talk about, though, is called the Silver Scrolls. This is a fascinating discovery, the Silver Scrolls, also known as the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls. And the biblical passage that this entails, is included on these scrolls, is the Aaronic blessing. This is found in Numbers 6, verses 24 to 26. And let's talk about what is that? What is the Aaronic blessing? Well, the context of this is, the Exodus, right? We have the Exodus out of Egypt. It occurred in 1446, according to 1 Kings 6:1. A natural reading of 1 Kings 6:1 indicates, and we'll talk more about this later, that the Exodus occurred around approximately 1446 BC. So Abraham's descendants, right, Joseph, and are down in Egypt. A family goes down to Egypt, but a nation comes out of Egypt, right? A nation comes out of Egypt in the Exodus when Moses leads them out of Egypt, and they're to go into the land of promise and to conquer that land and to receive that land that was promised to Abraham before them. So we have the Exodus occurs in 1446. While in the wilderness, in preparation to go into the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the law is given to Moses, given by Moses to the Hebrew people. And at Mount Sinai, and then they're preparing, of course, they have a lot of challenges in the wilderness, right? That whole generation dies in the wilderness because of their rebellion against God, and only those who are under 20 when that occurred will actually get to see the Promised Land. And so the Aaronic blessing occurs when God tells Aaron and his sons to bless the children of Israel, and he gives them this Aaronic blessing. So they are to take this prayer or this blessing and to bless the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel. And that blessing we read in Numbers 6, 24 to 26, a portion of it reads, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and grant you peace." That would be a very important prayer of blessing that the Hebrew people would have embraced, right? And that's why we're going to see it crop up here in these scrolls that we're going to talk about. So a blessing of God upon Abraham's descendants as they are preparing to enter into the Promised Land. So that's all a little bit background. Let's talk about the scrolls. Now, the scroll of blessing that's made, that's read by, or that's prayed over the Hebrew people. So the discovery, let me introduce you to Gabriel Bar Kai. Gabriel Bar Kai actually died last week. Gabriel Bar Kai is a famous archaeologist, Israeli archaeologist. He was born, actually, I forgot to tell my wife this, he was born in the Jewish ghetto of Budapest, 1944. Think about dates. What's happening in 1944? World War II is about to come to an end, right? In fact, the ghetto in Hungary was one of the few that survived. And so Gabriel Bar Kai was one of those that survived the Holocaust, and his family relocated to Israel in 1950, so shortly after the war was over. And remember 1948? Maybe you don't remember it, but you know that date. That's when Israel became a nation, and peoples that survived the Holocaust from all over the world are going to Israel, and his family was one of those families. So he's an Israeli archaeologist who was trained at Tel Aviv Theology, which is in Tel Aviv University, which is in Israel, Tel Aviv, Israel. Well, the discovery, Bar Kai and his team were excavating a burial site in Jerusalem, known as Ketef Hinnom. That's why they are sometimes called the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls, because they were discovered at a burial site named Ketef Hinnom. And Hinnom simply means valley, and Ketef is the word for shoulder. So it's the side of this valley. So shoulder of the valley where this particular burial site was that they were excavating at. A Google Earth version that helps you see here's where they were excavating. And you see the valley here, the Hinnom Valley. And then up here is where the Temple Mount is, where the temple used to be, and where now there's a Muslim shrine on top of it, which the temple was destroyed in AD 70, right? And so it's at the Ketef Hinnom that in 1979, Gabriel Bar Kai and his team excavated there, a 7th century burial site, and they have a fascinating discovery. This is that location, the tomb that where these scrolls were discovered. Now, this is a really fascinating story because a lot of the stories of the discoveries are fascinating. We'll talk about them, and I love to include those, the original firsthand account in my book. There's Bar Kai shares about the story of this 13-year-old little Nathan, he called him. And little Nathan wanted to help, and he was just an irritant to Barkai, and Barkai was just trying to get him out of the way. So he gives him a very trivial task. He's to go over to this tomb. He's to sweep it, clean it up for pictures. Right? That's what he is to do. But he gets bored. And what do young boys do when they get bored? They get a little rambunctious. He's got a hammer, and he's hammering the ground. What he thinks is the ground. But it's not the floor. It's actually a ceiling that was above them that had collapsed. And he's hammering this floor, and it cracks, and it reveals thousands of artifacts, many of which were more than 2,500 years old. Because now you have the roof on top of the ground, and between them, you have all of these ancient artifacts that would have long been taken by grave robbers, right, who would have sold it in the black market, the antiquities market. So little Nathan, who was sent to just get out of Barkai's way and to sweep an area because of his hammer in hand, cracked the floor, and it revealed thousands of artifacts, 2,500 years old. So here is, on the left, is a picture of what it looked like before it was unscrolled. This is the scroll made out of silver, and these are two different scrolls that were discovered. And we'll talk about each one of them. But before being unrolled, they were no larger than a diameter of a quarter, or if you're from Europe, euro, right? They resembled cigarette butts, right? Pretty small. They had a hole in the middle. These were in ancient Hebrew. You can only imagine how careful they had to be in unraveling this to make sure it didn't fall apart in their hands. But the scrolls contained a hole in the middle where a string could have been strung. And so I believe as well, that this would have been a necklace that would have been worn around these original believers' necks. And it would have had the Aaronic blessing on it, a memory of God's promise of blessing to the Jewish people. So this is Ketef Hinnom Scroll number 1. It's just labeled KH1 for Ketef Hinnom 1. It's 3.75 inches long and only 1 inch wide. So this is very small, right? It's not intended to be read. It's intended to be worn. Then the second scroll is even smaller. It's only 1.5 inches long and 0.5 inch wide. But again, what was written on it is far more important than discovering an ancient scroll. So of those thousands of artifacts found, this is by far the most valuable one because it affirms the biblical record. Here's the Silver Scrolls wording on it, a portion of it, and most of it is there. Anything in brackets is reconstructed. But you can see a portion of it. May bless you. Yahweh is the name of God for Lord. Our English Bibles translate it Lord. May bless you, Lord, and keep you. May his Lord's face upon you and grant you peace. That's the Silver Scroll 2. And similar wording here, may bless you, Lord, keep you. May his face shine upon you, right? So it's the portions that survive. This is what we have, right? This is very significant for several reasons, right? First, the Silver Scroll contains the earliest writing recorded in the Bible. The earliest writing, right? This is the earliest reference to anything of a biblical nature in writing. And this predates even the Dead Sea Scrolls by 400 years. Dead Sea Scrolls were the great Isaiah scroll that was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls later. And the Isaiah scroll is dated about 120 BC. So this is 400 years earlier than that. So for this to survive is very remarkable. The contents of these scrolls are virtually the same as those of manuscripts discovered 1,500 years later, right? This is the same language, same wording that we know today in our Bibles today. Why? Because it was in the manuscripts and has been passed down carefully all the way to us. Now, this also, I think, is very significant, and we'll have to talk a little bit about this liberal position known as the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, named after the liberal scholar Wellhausen. The dating of these scrolls before the exile, so 722 to 650 BC, the dating of these scrolls debunks the views of critical, we could use the language minimalist if you want, right? It takes only a minimal amount of what the Bible says to be true. Scholars known as Wellhausen documentary hypothesis. And that hypothesis was basically that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, that it developed over time, and sometimes the language is called the JEDP, referring to the Yahwist for J, Elohist for E, Deuteronomist for D, and P for priestly. These different four groups of people that wrote the Pentateuch, and it developed evolutionary development, these different formations or different components over time, not Moses. And they'd say Moses couldn't write. They would say, this view came out of what's called higher criticism in Germany, liberal German scholarship. And basically, they're coming from a completely anti-supernatural bias worldview. And so how could these things occur? There's no Exodus, right? They didn't believe in an Exodus. They didn't believe in these supernatural events recorded in Genesis as it relates to Moses and the plagues, right? They just believed that it was a group of people, later maybe Canaanites, that galvanized together and create a history for themselves. And so they believed that this portion, known as the Aaronic blessing, was a part of the P document, the priestly rituals, which they said would be after the exile. So long, long after the events recorded in the Exodus. Okay. Well, these are my words. There's no compelling reason to doubt Mosaic authorship, and every reason to accept the historically held position of the church and of Judaism that Moses was literate and he wrote the words recorded in the Pentateuch. Once again, the Bible withstands the scrutiny of historical and archaeological inspection. David Schreiner says it this way in his book, Pondering the Spade. He says, as for what this all means for Wellhausen's ideas, it means that the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls contribute to the onslaught against the documentary hypothesis, classically defined, making it largely untenable. So the documentary hypothesis, again, is this JEDP idea that these are different documents developed over time into one writing, kind of an evolutionary idea of the Pentateuch developing, not written by Moses. And this was very much the accepted liberal scholarship of the day in Europe, then actually penetrated Southern Seminary, many Princeton, Union Theology, many seminaries in the U.S., because we sent our professors over to get PhDs and come back. And unfortunately, many seminaries were also impacted by these ideas, right? Which is basically an anti-supernatural posture trying to explain in a scientific way how the Pentateuch could come together. This is the first surviving inscription of a biblical passage that includes the Tetragrammaton as well, which is Yahweh, the name for God, God's divine name, and the Hebrew people would not pronounce it. It's unpronounceable. They would not repeat this name. They would, that is Yahweh. And so this discovery, again, silenced the German liberal scholarship that was passed on throughout all the world, really. It's on display today in the Israel Museum, and you can look at it here up close. So I know that's kind of deep and heavy and lots of details to it, but you can watch this over again if you like. My 6 to 8 minute videos available on this subject as well. All right, the Merneptah Stele is what we're going to talk about now. The Merneptah Stele, a couple of passages of scripture that relate to the Merneptah Stele we'll look at here. Judges 1, 17 and 18 mentions Ashkelon, a Philistine city. Right? Then Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and Judah took Gaza with his territory and Ashkelon. Now, these are Philistine cities that would have been promised to the Jewish people, right? And so they're in the conquest taking those properties. Now, today, you hear Gaza Strip, right? This is the same land. This is a city, Gaza, ancient Philistine city in the Gaza Strip today, but here it is on the Mediterranean Sea. This is where, just north of where all of the atrocities took place, right? As the slaughtering of the Jewish people from the Gaza Strip came and killed many. 1 Kings 9 mentions Gezer, another city. We'll look at, again, Solomon mentions him building a city of Gezer. Here's the location of Gezer. 1 Kings 6 mentions another important thing related to the Merneptah Stele. It mentions that there are the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. So we have a timestamp as to when the Exodus occurred. It tells us when Solomon, 4th year of Solomon's reign, and we have a good date for that. We know when that is, so we can go back 480 years to get an understanding of when the Exodus occurs. These are important passages that will relate to the Merneptah Stele. Now remember, the United Kingdom, Saul's reign began around 1050 BC, David's reign about 1010 BC, and then Solomon's reign around 970 BC. So we're working our ways closer to 0 BC, right? This all relates to the Merneptah Stele. So 480th year, if the 480th year from working our way back from Solomon's reign to the Exodus, right? He's mentioning when Solomon has a building project, builds the house of the Lord, the temple, when he builds fortified cities, it's his 4th year of his reign, which is 480 years after the Exodus. So if we use this passage and we know Solomon's reign's 970 BC, then we add 480 years, right, to get 1450. But then the text says it's the 4th year, right? So we need to subtract 4 years because it's the 4th year. So that gives us an approximate date of the Exodus around 1446. That's the conservative view following the biblical text. Another passage that relates to this Merneptah Stele is Judges. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. So before the kingdom was established by David, and then expanded by Saul, then expanded by David, and then fortified by Solomon. Before that, the time of the Judges, right? There was no king in the land. All right, those are all the biblical passages that relate to the Merneptah Stele. The discovery of the Merneptah Stele. This is discovered in 1896 by Sir William Flanders Petrie. It's discovered in what's known as Western Thebes, modern-day Luxor. I went there last year, teach in Alexandria up north on the Mediterranean. So we fly into Cairo, then we travel up to Alexandria, and I teach there. At the end of the teaching time, I drove back to Cairo and flew down to Luxor for a day because I wanted to see the Merneptah Stele, the location it was discovered. And the Shishak relief, which we'll talk about later, another important archaeological discovery. So Petrie was down there excavating at the Merneptah mortuary temple, so a place that he was building to honor him after he dies. That's what it was. It was a temple to worship him after he dies. That's what a mortuary temple is. And he's excavating there, and he called the place, his excavation, very disastrously dull, and was tempted to leave it as fruitless. But thankfully he didn't, because the Merneptah Stele was discovered in the last corner of the excavated area. And here's a picture of the mortuary temple of Merneptah. Here's the location where the Merneptah Stele was discovered, in that last corner of the area that they were excavating. And again, the mortuary temple is not where he would actually be buried. He was found later called the Valley of the Kings, where lots of the pharaohs were buried. I went to that location as well, saw the burial location of Merneptah. But the mortuary temple was to worship him after he dies. And so the Merneptah Stele was constructed there to honor him and all of his military conquests. Again, that's what they did. They built this stele is a standing block of stone, upright stone. And this is the location it was discovered. This isn't the original. The original was then moved to Cairo, Egypt, to the Cairo Museum, much more accessible to most people. And so I have pictures of that. I've been there as well. And this is a colleague of mine who was teaching with me. This is to scale, yes. It's huge. Yeah, we'll give you those details here in a moment. So steles, Petrie goes on. Sometimes it's called a stela or stele. I like the British way of saying it, stele. This stele will be better known in the world than anything else I've found, he said. And he was right. This is one of the most important, maybe top 10 discoveries. So let's talk about the artifact. A stele is an upright stone slab, much like we'd find in our cemeteries, right? But this stele is named after Pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned in the early 1200s. It's made of black granite. It's 10.4 feet tall and 5.4 feet wide and 12 inches deep. These are my pictures. This is a picture I took of it just to show you the depth of it, right? I have one picture with a credit card that barely, goes over the top of that, but this is 12 inches deep. This is a huge monument. The top portion of the monument here is a picture of the top portion. And here we have the Egyptian god Amun-Ra, which we'll see again in the Shishak relief. This is the god of the sun that they worshipped down there. Amun-Ra twice depicted. And he's handing a sword to Merneptah to say, I gave you this military accomplishment. All that you've written here was given by the gods, right? This is, again, propaganda. And Merneptah's belief that the gods enabled him to have all these military successes. Then to the right of Merneptah is the god Khonsu. And you'll see Khonsu all over Egypt in the different temples there as well. And then to the left, this goddess Mut. Now, that's all interesting, but what's most interesting to us is what's written in hieroglyphics in the inscription. In the inscription, it says, carried off his Ashkelon, seized upon his Gezer. Yunoam is made as that which does not exist. So here we have biblical sites, locations mentioned in the Bible. We talked about Ashkelon, the location of the Philistine city that would be given to Israel in the conquest. We talked about Gezer, another city that Solomon's going to fortify, and we'll look at the Solomon gates that Solomon have been discovered in Gezer and Hatzor and Megiddo, but this is one of those cities that Solomon built to fortify and protect the nation of Israel. So the Merneptah Stele mentions lots of different cities that he attacked and destroyed during this period of time, before the kingdom was established, before the United Kingdom. And it says, Israel's laid waste, his seed is not. Now he's lying here, because the archaeological record and history points to the fact that he did not destroy Israel. But what's interesting here, a couple things, is this is the hieroglyphic. And at the end of each hieroglyphic relating to the cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yunoam, there's this what they call a determinative at the end. And this determinative, the scholars have believed, indicates that this is a city-state. So these are city-states. And that's what this determinative or this symbol represents. But then Israel, here's the first time Israel's mentioned on stone. And this is far earlier than the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis said, right? They didn't even believe Israel existed, is created in their imagination, this idea of an exodus and occupying the land. So here we have two determinatives that point the fact that they are not a city-state yet and don't have a king, right? City-state would have a king. Let's look at all the implications here. First, the Merneptah Stele is the earliest source that mentions Israel by name. Herschel Shanks says it this way: if you're looking for evidence of early Israel, it would be hard to imagine something better than this, a people living in the area where and when, according to the biblical account, the Israelites were said to be emerging. So Merneptah is speaking of this people group in the land of promise. This is the period of the Judges era. And so it's mentioning Israel by name. The Merneptah Stele also places Israel in the land. This is dated to 1210 BC. Herschel Shanks, another scholar, archaeologist, says it this way: the Israelites were so important that Pharaoh of Egypt knew of them. You don't brag about supposedly defeating a people group that isn't important or significant. It must have been worth bragging about. Obviously, he didn't wipe them off the planet. He didn't destroy them as he brags, but he mentions this not city-state, but people group. Right? So the Merneptah Stele makes the latest of the Exodus dates. Remember, we talked about 1440, the best date for the Exodus. Well, they're in the land in 1210. So those who say the Exodus happened much later, there are dates that date it after 1210. Well, that can't be true. They're already in the land according to the Merneptah Stele. So the Merneptah Stele indicates that the nation of Israel's in the land in 1210 was not yet a fortified kingdom, just as the Bible indicates, right? In those days, Israel had no king. That's what the biblical text tells us, right? And so you can go to the Egypt Museum today and see it on display in the Cairo Museum.